Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about the terms. We're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. And we're going to talk about three terms that are very close to the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition community. Geek, nerd, dork. All right, let's hit it. All right, so why are we going to talk about this? Well, guess what? We essentially own these words, right? If you say to somebody, hey, what's a nerd? They're going to go, like, if you spin around and throw a rock in America, foam rock, you're going to hit somebody, and you just hit the average person. This is what they're going to say. Oh, nerd. Right, okay, three things that define a nerd. Taped glasses, Dungeons and Dragons, and no dates. There you go, right? And this came from the 80s, right? This really mattered in the 80s because the badge nerd was a serious it was a slur in the 80s. I'm not sure it's a slur today. Dork remains a slur, right? Now the reason why we're going to talk about these today is these words matter to our community because if you are Dungeons & Dragons 1E, Dungeons & Dragons 2E, Dungeons & Dragons 3E, if you came up with those, these words meant a lot to you, right? These words still mean something today to Dungeons & Dragons 4th and 5th, the people who came up playing 4th and 5th edition. So that's like Gen Z and millennials, right? But if you were Gen X or a boomer, right, we all have different relationships with these words, right? Now, I've already given a definition of nerd, and you can find that on my channel, right? But I actually heard someone who brought actually some data analysis to this. So there's a gentleman by the name of Vincent Harinam, and he is a data analysis person who puts a data analysis on cultural trends, which I think is absolutely fascinating. That's a really exciting, cool, that's a cool thing to do. I think that's really interesting, right? So Vincent Harinam did this data analysis, and actually he was brought onto a YouTube. He was interviewed by another YouTuber, right? And the YouTuber called him a nerd, and he corrected him and said, "I'm a geek." Right? And I'll tell you why, because I've defined these terms, right? And so this is a gentleman, a data analyst, who is defining these terms based on logic, right? And I think it's a really interesting breakdown. And since, Dungeons and Dragons is literally an ingredient in nerd, geek, dork, right? Or the outside world thinks that, we should look at this. So I want to break this down for you. And then let's talk about it in context to Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, okay? All right, so here we go. So basically, you have this. So basically, Vincent Harinam. By the way, you'll find the link for that video right down below. For where Vincent Harinam corrects this. And so basically, the YouTuber who's interviewing him says, "Hey, it calls him a nerd." He says, "No, I'm a geek." And the guy says, "What's the difference?" He says, "Well, there's three terms, right? There's geek, nerd, and dork, and they're all a hair's breadth away from each other, but they really are different, and I'll explain to you how they're different." So this is what Vincent Harinam said. He said, it has to do with intellectualism and utility, right? So let's look at a geek, okay? Top of the hierarchy, and it goes down, right? So geeks are more valuable than nerds, according to Vincent Harinam. And nerds are actually, I don't want to say valuable. Let's say this: if somebody's going to apply this to you, if you're applying Harinam's structure, you want geek applied to you, then you want nerd applied to you, and you don't ever want, and maybe you want nerd applied to you less, and then you never want dork applied to you. All right, so let's talk about it. All right, and he gives examples of this, right? So, and I'll give you the examples. So he said. Geek has intellectualism, right? So they look at specific topics with an intellectual approach, right? Like they're taking it serious. They're going to read everything. They're going to take notes. They're going to structure things, right? They're going to look at it from a logical perspective, and they're going to pursue it with an intellectual rigor, right? Then there's utility, all right? So if they go and they study this thing, there is utility to it, right? Utility to average Americans, and utility and value that will actually be purchased by people who have businesses and want to generate money. Utility, right? So a geek, right? So I think he was saying like a Star Trek geek, right? He looks at it from an intellectual perspective. Doesn't talk about it until he's seen every single episode. Looks at those episodes in the context of philosophy. Looks at them in the context of science. Looks at them in the context of television history, right? Looks at them in the context of culture, right? Of what role did Star Trek play in the cultural transformation of America, right? That's an intellectual approach. Why would this be utilized? Why would this have good utility, right? Well, let's say you started a podcast 10 years ago, right? Podcasts have outrageously high payments for their ads, higher than you will get on YouTube, right? So there are people who have had Star Trek who are brought in, or get great money for their ads on their podcasts, have YouTube channels that have been running for years and have gotten actual real money, and for some of them it's a business, right? Are brought into conventions as guests, flown in just to conduct panels on Star Trek. Utility, right? Money generated, usefulness, right? The information is useful and produces the same thing a job would produce, right? So a nerd, right? A nerd would be like someone who is into Pokemon, right? And so they play Pokemon and they bring an intellectual, like they know, okay, fighter is weak, ghost type is weak to dragon, right? And they look at it from an intellectual perspective. They do a lot of memorization. They know the history of Pokemon, right? But they just play Pokemon on their Nintendo. That's all they ever do, and they talk to their friends. There's no utility. That's a nerd, right? A dork, right, is someone who has... and by the way, so a nerd has... So geek, intellectualism, yes. Utility, yes. Nerd, intellectualism, yes. Utility, no. Okay? Dork. Let's talk about a dork, all right? A dork, Evangelion, right? So does not come at it from an intellectual perspective. They're like, there's a lot of fan service in this, and I'm watching this so I can see the fan service. That's it. I really like the pilot suits, right? And then next, right? Just keeps watching Evangelion and talking to their friends, never does anything with it, never utilizes lessons learned to, in any way. So dork, intellectualism, no. Utility, no. Right? And I think this is really fascinating. So now, this is what I'm saying, right? What do you want to be when it comes to Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition? Do you want to be a geek? Do you want to bring an intellectual perspective and get utility out of it? I think the utility is understanding that Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is a self-improvement engine, right? That because Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, unlike any other version of Dungeons & Dragons, deals with honoring the past and accepting and dealing with the cultural questions of today in Dungeons & Dragons now, right? It forces us to look at ourselves, and we have to look at ourselves and answer questions about race in the Dungeons & Dragons world, and at the same time saying, well, if I'm doing this in my D&D world, and I'm respecting and I'm making sure that all races are included, shouldn't I be more supportive of BLM, right? We do the hard work. We don't let the game. We don't close our eyes when the double-sided mirror of Dungeons & Dragons points toward us, right? And so we're geeks, right? And then everybody was like, wait, I want to have a very intellectual approach to Dungeons & Dragons. I want to talk about medieval feudalism, right? But I absolutely do not want to talk about what my opinion is on people's preferences, right? And I don't want my opinions changed on that. And I don't want my politics changed by this, even though I need to very carefully look at politics and construct a world of conservatives versus liberals in Waterdeep and in Neverwinter and in Phandalin, right? Nerd, intellectualism, yes. Utility, no. Right? Not gonna improve themselves. Not gonna do anything of actual value, right? And then dork, right? That's your fatal players, right? Like no intellectual, no intellectual rigor being used to choose the bad. Like it's famous for being one of the worst, TTRPGs I ever played, and there's not any utility in playing it. Right, it's a heartbreaker. And actually, I think any game that's a heartbreaker, like one person was like, I see these really good, I see Dungeons and Dragons, but they got the longbow wrong. So I wrote a whole book, I wrote a whole tabletop role playing game because the ranges and the damage are right for longbow in my game. And if you think that people haven't done that, they have very much done that. Right, and those people like playing the worst tabletop role playing games and like dragging friends through them. That's a dork, right? And so we choose, where are we going to land? Are we going to be a nerd? Are we going to be a geek? Or are we going to get a dork? Right? I think Harinam's got something here. I think it's a really good breakdown, and that's how I think it fits. So I think if you're playing Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, you're a geek. If you're choosing to play the older versions of Dungeons and Dragons, you're a nerd. It's not valueless. It's not as bad as being a dork, right? And if you're playing a game like Fatal, right, then you're a dork, right? Like and it's not for us to. And here's the issue: I'm not saying, oh, hey, I'm going to run over there and call this person a dork. We should put this on ourselves, right? And also, trust and believe. If you're out there playing older versions of Dungeons and Dragons, I'm asking you, hey, do you want to remain a nerd? Or do you want to shift to that, that geek slot, right? And so I think it's, we don't use this to label others. We look at ourselves, right? And I look at myself. I think I'm a geek. You should use I think Harinam's structure is useful for looking at ourselves and choosing the label we want. And if you're a dork, right? If you're playing a game out there and you're not applying intellectualism to it and you are not applying utility to it, now you know. And you can pull yourself up the hierarchy. Right? Well, that's my opinion. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.